It's a pleasure for me to stand here right now and not be the one coming up here as I did for many years. Instead, I get to ask Megan Frick to come up, the Communications Director at the Department of Education. I hired Megan a few years ago, 4 years ago, wow. And Megan is phenomenal. I know y'all already know her. I know y'all have already worked with her. But Megan's going to come up and just talk to you a little bit about kind of operational things and the best way to get what you need. So, Megan, come on up.
Hey guys. It's great to be here today. I recognize a lot of names and some voices, but it's nice to actually put a face with a name for many of you. And if we haven't gotten a chance to connect, I'll be here the rest of the afternoon and would love to say hi. So I won't take up too much time, but I just want to talk a little bit about the Communications Division at DOE and the best way to reach us. So I included, these are kind of all the different things our division is responsible for at DOE. Everything from recognitions, Teacher of the Year, to our Ask DOE constituent services line. But probably what's of interest to people here, well, my slide didn't come up, but probably what's of interest is this first thing, press inquiries and outreach. So anytime that you have questions about DOE policies, State Board of Education policies, if you want to interview a DOE staff member, if you have data requests or public records requests for the department, for data we hold, or documents we have, or if you just need some assistance with source identification in your coverage area, things like I'm interested in this broad issue, but I need a school who's working on that, we can try and help you out. So you can contact us for any of that. We have a couple of other staff members who handle those other things I mentioned, but the two of us that you'll interact with are myself and then Jacqueline Harnevius, and Jacqueline's in the back. She's the person you'll see on my auto reply if I'm out of the office, or if you can't get in touch with me, you're always welcome to reach out to her. I included a picture so you could put a face with a name. And I wanted to do this picture of us with the superintendent, and I figured cutting out the other person in that picture wouldn't be a good. I'm just kidding. I would never cut him out. We've forgiven him for leaving us. So anyway, there's our contact information. And as you'll see on this next slide, I included this cheesy stock photo of emails because email is a great way to get in touch with us. I'm always happy to talk on the phone, answer whenever I can, but we do spend a fair amount of time in meetings. So sending over an email is often a great way to get in touch. With that said, I know that I miss emails occasionally, and please feel free to follow up as many times as necessary. If I haven't answered, it's because I missed it. It's not because we don't want to comment. If that's the case, I'll just tell you. So you'll never offend me by following up and saying, why haven't you answered my email? Here's my cell phone number. I don't include this on press releases. I don't know if Matt did, but if he did, he's braver than I am. But feel free to, another cheesy graphic here, text me anytime. Occasionally over a long holiday, I'll let my work phone die, but pretty much evenings, weekends, I shouldn't say that, but if you text me, I'll see it. So if you just have a quick question, or again, if you've sent me an email or called me and you haven't heard back for whatever reason, feel free to shoot me a text. One of the requests I've gotten more than anything else since being in this job is, can you give us a release calendar? And I would have loved to walk in here and hand you every date of everything we're going to release, but I can't, because often we don't know this far in advance when everything's going to come out. So I did want to give you at least a general idea of when to expect things this year. Basically, CCRPI, the first schools identified for comprehensive and targeted support, and graduation rate you'll see in the fall. And then Georgia milestones, we expect you'll see that in the summer, July or August of this year. Remember, that's the statewide public release. Parents, teachers, students see their individual scores earlier. SAT and ACT, keeping in mind that those aren't our tests, so we can't control this, but they typically release in September. I try to give a heads up at least a day before, hopefully with more advance notice, anytime we have one of those big releases coming out. Once we know the exact date, I try to let you guys know. But you'll only receive those if you receive emails from our press listserv. So if for whatever reason you're not subscribed to that, please send me an email and ask to be added. There's a more complicated, you can like send a blank email, but it's hard to describe, and I would rather you just send me a note and I'll add you to the list. If the emails and press releases you're getting from us are from the press listserv, they'll have this at the bottom saying you're subscribed. If you signed up for email notifications through this little piece on our website, you're not getting emails that are just to the press list. So those are just a few things about the best way to contact us. I don't know if you guys will have any questions for me because you've talked with a lot of DOE folks this morning, but if you do, I'm happy to answer them.
Megan, are you releasing, I know you put a lot of things on your social media pages, are you, is the press being notified at the same time or earlier than you are doing your own outreach? So are we getting the press release at the same time as going up on your website, or do we need to constantly monitor?
Oh, you guys get it first. So typically, I'll send to press, then send to like the broader listserv if it's something that's going out, then we'll post on web and social media. Okay. So I would take a look at social media and those other outlets for things that may not be going out as an email, but for press releases, I think just monitoring your email is the best way to do it. Anything else? All right, that was painless.
Thank you so much, Megan. Y'all asked me a couple of questions a couple of times, and you know, I know, I'm kidding. It got to where y'all didn't need to. You want to come on up, Diane? I'm going to have our Vice President, Diane Hopkins, come up, and she is going to introduce the next speaker while I pull up Alan's PowerPoint.
No pressure here, man.
Yeah, really. Here we go. Clicker there.
Well, I'm going to get the afternoon session kicked off with all of you. It's hard to believe the morning went by as quickly as it did. But I'm here to welcome Alan Richard, who is joining us today for our afternoon session. Alan is a national education writer, but I know a lot of you know him from his previous role as communications director for the Southern Regional Education Board. He's written for a number of education publications here of late. We brought him in to work with us here at the Georgia Partnership about a year ago. We're actually leading the efforts on organizing and creating community engagement, more communications, public engagement around equity issues, and doing it on a regional basis with several of our other state organization partners across the Southeast. And when we brought Alan in, he was absolutely the right person at the right time to lead this equity project that we're doing. He is a native of the South, and he absolutely has a passion and an enthusiasm for really doing what's right for kids in the Southeast, giving them the opportunities they need, but also just raising awareness about the unique challenges that we have throughout this region. So Alan, I will ask you to come forward.
Thank you, Diane. Hi, everybody. I'll make room for my computer in addition to another computer. Whoever's Mac up here is really big. Whoops, and I totally messed it up. Yeah. Let's see. What do I need to hit? Slides? Hey, cool. All right. Yes, thank you for being here. Thanks for sticking around after lunch, too. And we'll have a panel discussion here in a few minutes with Dr. Green from DeKalb County and others here in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to tell you about something that you need to know is on the horizon. And this is a project that we've been working on at the Georgia Partnership, along with 6 similar organizations in 6 other states. So, and this project is being done by something called the Columbia Group. And the Columbia Group is nothing mysterious. It's simply a loose affiliation of 7 education policy and advocacy organizations in the southern states. So there's the Georgia Partnership, which you all know well, and similar groups in Alabama, Louisiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So there's 3 main parts to our project. First, there's a landmark report, a report on how the southern states need to set some new directions in improving education and in closing gaps in opportunity and achievement. The second part of this project is what we think is the first ever education poll of the South, an actual asking of voters across the southern states for their feedback on education issues and ways to address them. And then third, we're releasing all of that information with help from our friends in the news media and with events with policymakers and so forth. I should add that this is not the official release of the report or the poll results. That's why you don't have it at your table. Right now, we're planning for the public release to be January 30th. So mark down January 30th, and we'll be in touch with you individually in the meantime, but we're open to having interviews and giving you embargoed information. And can you consider this a preview? So this is not off the record or anything like that. Feel free to tweet something if you'd like, or even write something if you'd like. But we'd appreciate it if you wait until the official release on January 30th for full coverage, because we'll be able to give you a ton more information between now and then. So first, just very briefly, the report. I spent last summer traveling the South and talking with all kinds of people about education issues. Educators, state officials, teachers, principals, school superintendents, business leaders, civil rights leaders, and very importantly, we talked with a lot of parents and students about their thoughts on how their schools were doing in their state and in their communities and how they could do better. What we found was considerable consensus across the region on issues that need to be addressed and even some ways in which we might be able to address them. There are 4 main findings in the report that's coming. The first involves drawing better talent into the teaching profession and also providing much more support at the state and local level for educators than we ever have before. Our hope is that the southern states will truly become the best places in the nation to teach. I realize that's an ambitious goal, but that's what we're going with. Secondly, that today's students, many of whom come from low-income families, need different types of support than yesterday's students, if you will. Many of you know about Marietta High School, which has been mentioned already today, outside of Atlanta, for their incredible array of wraparound services that's being considered a possible model for the state of Georgia. There's a little article on Marietta High School in our report. Students need more academic and non-academic types of support than they ever have. Third, a stronger bridge between high school and what comes after high school, whether it's work, career training, or college. It includes all of those things. In this day and age, students' next step after high school should never be a mystery, but for many students it still is. The transition should be easier and clearer for every student. And lastly, we've got to ensure that the right resources are there and that they're targeted to address inequalities that plague our schools and communities and hold some of our states and communities back. So now we get to the fun stuff. The education poll of the South. Again, to our knowledge, it's the first of its kind. We polled 2,200 registered voters across 10 states, including Georgia, and we also included northern Florida and southern Virginia. We figure northern Florida is about where the South stops, even though, anyway, culturally. And voters were evenly divided among these states, and generally matched in terms of gender, age, racial background, location, and so forth. And by the way, you can raise your hand and stop me if you have
Political party as well.
questions. Hi.
Political party.
And political parties as well, which I'm about to show you. Aha. I didn't know it was the next slide. Okay. So a lot of you know, having covered politics in the South, that voter registration rolls don't always match up with how people vote in presidential elections and so forth. So that's why you're seeing some of this data. But you see that in the South, about a third identify themselves as Republicans in our poll, about a third Democrat. But it's important to consider that there are a good many independents or others, many of whom identify themselves as conservative. By the way, and Ty and say others, I'm happy to send these slides to you after this. And here's how people describe themselves politically on most issues. You can see that in the South and in Georgia, about 40% say they're conservative, about a third say they're moderate. So, that sort of makes sense to me that about 3/4 of Georgians say that they're moderate or conservative. Same with racial ethnic background of voters. These tend to match voter rolls. In Georgia, you can see that almost a third of those polled were African American, which is a little larger rate than in the South as a whole. So here's the fun stuff. We asked voters a lot of questions, so we have a lot of data we can share with you. But first we asked them, how do you feel about the quality of public schools across your state in the last few years? And you can see that the largest group in the South said that the quality of their schools has kind of stayed about the same. Almost as many said that they've actually gotten worse. In Georgia, the largest group, slightly, said they've actually gotten worse, but a good many also said they've stayed about the same. Only 18% in the region and in the state say their schools have actually gotten better in their state. Do public schools do an adequate job of educating all students in schools across the state? Or do differences exist in how well students are educated? Most Southern voters recognize that there are differences in the quality of education students receive. 3 out of 4 in both the South and in Georgia. Very few say there aren't any differences. So voters recognize this issue. Now, for the next slide, I joked with the Columbia Group organizations, the Georgia Partnership and others, that my hope was that 51% of Southerners would recognize that maybe in fact we should do something about the differences in quality of education and some of the inequalities and inequities that exist in schools. Well, 87% of Southern voters said that they would support their state improving public schools and addressing these differences in the quality of education students receive. And almost that high percentage said so in Georgia. Pretty overwhelming. Just as interesting, we asked voters if they would support if their state would adjust the school funding system in their state to ensure greater fairness among wealthier and poorer communities. 84% of Southern voters supported this idea, 78% in Georgia. A lot of folks. Now, what about putting their money where their mouth is? And this is not just a school resources or school funding issue in our mind. This is a much broader conversation, but resources are part of this. Would you support your state raising taxes for more K-12 education funding? Now, a bit of a more tempered response here, but still a significant majority in the South and especially in Georgia, more than 2 out of 3 voters said, yeah, they'd pay more state taxes for education. Would you pay more local taxes to support education? Again, significant majorities of Southerners and Georgians said that they would. We found in focus groups that voters were more prone to say they're willing to spend more if they knew specifically what the funding was for. More appealing, however, to voters was the idea of prioritizing education over some other areas. 71 and 78% in the South and in Georgia, respectively, supported the idea of placing a higher priority for funding on education. So what does all this mean? And we have lots more where this came from, but in our mind, we found that most people agree that this is a problem, that the quality of education the kids have access to is terribly uneven in some cases, and most people get that. And this is true across all political views and backgrounds. Most people also recognize the urgent need to do something about it, that it'll help our economy, and that will help disadvantaged students and help strengthen our communities and our states. There seems to be fairly fair consensus on which issues need to be addressed and prioritized, that we can actually raise the bar for every child while also evening the playing field for every child. And the idea is that even in this very politically divided time, that this can be something that brings folks together across the aisle politically, but also culturally, different types of communities, age groups, and so forth. Maybe this is something that can bring us together to work better for the children in our states. So again, all this comes out publicly on January 30th. We'll need your help in spreading the word and providing some thoughtful coverage, if you will. And if you're with an education advocacy group, sharing this with your networks and so forth, we'll have materials available for you. And we're glad to set up interviews, anything you need. Matt and I are easily accessible, as you know, but there's my contact information, and you can come get my card as well. So I'm going to pause just for a second briefly for some questions, and then we'll move into our panel. Anybody have questions or thoughts? Yes, sir. Tell us who you are.
I'm Lee Sherrill with the Advocates Panel.
Welcome, Lee.
How did you break down conservatives versus liberals versus moderates in support for taxes and so forth?
We've got that data. I will say, I'm going to go back to that breakdown. Oops. This is how it broke down, of course, across the whole region and in Georgia. We've got answers. I can't remember if we have it by party or whether they describe themselves as conservative or moderate or liberal for every question or not, but we can try to get that data for you. The data is more reliable region-wide than it is state by state, just because we can only afford to poll so many people. But generally speaking, on a lot of these questions, the numbers kind of looked the same for every group. There's some variation, certainly. But that was really surprising to us, and it was surprising to the pollster, who was a Republican political polling firm based in Virginia. Hey.
Katie Whitlock, I work for Appen Media Group, and I cover North Fulton. I cover the Fulton County School Board, but only North Fulton. So I cover a district that has among the wealthiest schools, in a district that has some of the poorest schools as well. And this is the conversation that's been going on for decades. Do you have examples of where money equaled achievement? Because in the state of Georgia, that's difficult to find. The highest, some of the highest cost per pupil are in some of the lowest performing. So do you have examples where throwing money at this, raising taxes, doing all that, actually does result in lasting change, not year by year, lasting?
Well, the Georgia Partnership and these other organizations are not necessarily advocating for higher taxes or anything like that, but we thought we would ask people about, how resources factor in to the quality of education that's available for students. We have examples throughout the report of best practices in states across the South and a variety of topics, wraparound services, recruiting teachers into STEM fields, what it's like in rural areas, and that sort of thing. But, you know, the one thing I would caution you about is just looking at funding at per pupil spending only. I mean, per pupil spending just tends to be higher in urban and rural areas because costs can be higher. In rural areas, there's the transportation issue, which we'll discuss on our panel in just a second. In urban areas, you know, salaries can be higher and services, facilities upkeep and so forth. So those are factors that you know, so there's different ways of looking at funding. I mean, the best way was I asked educators and community members in different parts of the South, you know, what does your tax base and so forth look like? What do you need? And in fact, in the Georgia Partnership's EdQuest report under school funding, you know, there's kind of the recommendation that in fact we sort of figure out what students need and do our best to figure out what that costs. And therefore, base funding decisions and perhaps decisions about the future of the school funding formula in Georgia on that as opposed to other ways of looking at it, because it seems to make sense that, you know, sort of putting what we need before, anyway, I could go on about that all day, but questions, comments? And we'll move into our panel, but we'll keep this conversation going. So thank you so much and appreciate your interest in this.